My name's Elena Grider, and this is Audrey Long at Bryan Station High School, and I'm here, well, first let me say that I'm taking a class at Georgetown College for ESL Advocacy, and so I'm here to talk to you about the things that I've been learning, and kind of some like recommendations to kind of better your school.
Okay.
But I just wanted to first start off by like kind of reviewing, how someone learns English. In the past, where you could see the trend of a lot of, drills, like oral drills, and a lot of reading and translation practice, and also memorization dialogues. And so you've had all of these things, but as research developed, we learned that that wasn't the best approach for all students. So then they kind of changed their mind towards what we call like language acquisition, which is what you're familiar with. But, that's when you're actively listening, reading, writing, and speaking in the new language. So kind of to facilitate that, need to have the language skill, which is knowing how to use it and knowing the language. Then you also need the teaching skill, which is the methods, talking about the theories, and, skills for designing those activities that are meaningful to them. And then lastly, which is to me the most important part, which is the teacher dispositions, like building that respect and rapport with the students, having that positive mentality, that enthusiasm, also creating that multicultural and welcoming environment, because, they're coming in feeling very, like, alienated, like, I've never been here, I don't know what to expect. And so these are kind of, like, the feelings that they come in, knowing, like, okay, how do I navigate the school, and, of course, like, they're also, when they're learning the language, they have a language ego that's starting to form, because now they're combining what they already have with what they're learning with the new language. So, kind of encompassing all of those things, being able to value and acknowledge and celebrate those things that they came to the school with, and then adding what they're learning now is what we really need to do. And so, kind of to tag on that, we have, of course, effective teacher qualities, like being meaningful, which doesn't always have to apply just to the activities, but also to the walls, because, I mean, they're like a third teacher, which I never really thought about, because, you see it, but that's also saying something to the students, too. Because I have students in my class that they look to the walls for, like, help, and if I don't have something, they're, like, running around the room like, where's your number line? And I was just like, well, I have to, like, explain to them, why I might not have that resource, or if I'm working on it, this is what I'm going to be bringing it to you all to help you in class. So, the wall really does make a difference in helping them learn as well. You want to be authentic, which is, taking those real-life experiences to the classroom. I don't know if you've ever worked with, what is it called? It's like a virtual reality, I think, in like Google. I think there might be something in the making. They might not have it just yet.
But so we do have VR at our school, because we have an IT academy embedded here, and I've actually used it with my students. So in the reading class, one of the things that we do is we read both fiction and nonfiction texts, and first semester is not student choice. And that's by design, because they do have to learn certain skills. I have to be able to control what they're reading. And one of the books that we read is actually, it's considered upper elementary to lower middle school. It's called From the Mixed Up Files of Mrs. Basil E. Frankweiler. And a large chunk of the book is set in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. And we collaborated with our school's VR team, which are other students, their peers. We have 2 different VR headsets and VR machines, so they were actually able to walk through the Metropolitan Museum of Art and see, like, we were able to point out, this is the Egyptian room where this happens. This is the, Middle English period where they slept. And so Realia is actually much more accessible nowadays than it was even 5 years ago, because we have those resources. And because our IT VR team is peer driven. It's driven by students, not administrators or teachers. They actually get a much more effective learning, so because it's peer to peer. So they can drop some of those affective filters that they have with the adults in the building, and it can be a much more interesting experience, because then they also get some of that ancillary learning, right? Where all of a sudden they're not just picking up on, oh, this is what a statue is, or this is where this setting is, but then they're starting to have conversations, and by necessity, those conversations are in English, because the VR team, like some of them are Spanish immersion, but we definitely don't have kind of Rwandan or Swahili or Mandarin speakers. So then they're sort of getting that real-time learning about, oh, well, this is a stand, right? So they, even some of that little immersive experience where they're having this conversation with their peer about this really cool thing has allowed them to encounter realia. It has allowed them to access reading material in a different way. It's also given them a peer-to-peer conversation, which is forcing use in the secondary, or in many of our students, tertiary language, without having to deal with the affective filter of talking to an adult. They're much more relaxed because it's a peer, and they kind of don't care as much. You know, they're much more concerned, especially some of the cultures my students represent, they're much more concerned with what adults think.
Right.
Whereas, you know, this American sophomore, they are not nearly as concerned about making mistakes, so they get that opportunity to practice. And what's interesting is American students, by nature, recast. They don't know they're doing it. It's hilarious. I've watched it happen for years.
Right.
Where
Like
students, right, it's a very subconscious thing that they do because they want to make sure the kids get it right the next time. So my kids might say, oh, that's an stand, right? Because in Spanish, they don't really have the solitary S as a start sound. So they say, oh, it's an stand. And the kids will naturally be like, no, it's a stand, not a stand, stand. And so they get some of that, you know, kind of as that ancillary language learning while being able to access things in multiple ways.
So I like that because in a way they're becoming like self-regulated learners.
Right.
And that way they're being accountable, like, okay, this is actually how you say it.
Right.
So that whenever they do come into a situation where they have to apply what they've learned, then they'll feel more comfortable and be able to express what they have to say. So I definitely, that's what I love about virtual reality. I actually learned about it maybe a couple years ago.
Right.
And it was like first starting up, and I was like, I can't imagine like being able to wear these things that give you that kind of experience. So I really liked that.
Well, and it was interesting too for some of our students, particularly our refugee kids who have never been in what we would consider a traditional school setting. You know, they're coming to the U.S. at 15, 16 years old, and maybe they've had some refugee schooling, but they also are dealing with technology. Like we have students enroll who've never dealt with a computer, right? Like that's not available in refugee camps. And so they're also bridging that acculturation gap because every American kid from kindergarten on is immersed in technology. You know, my 5-year-old niece can work technology better than I can. But many of these kids come and they don't have that. So we're not just dealing with the academic language, we're not just dealing with L2 acquisition, we're also dealing with an acculturation piece that is vital for them. And so they're able to do it in this way that's really interesting. And so it's not just like being on a computer to type a paper, but it's this really interesting experience. But then they're also starting to bridge that gap because they're like, okay, so this is, I've heard about this maybe. I've heard someone talk about virtual reality. I had no idea what that was. You know, like one of my students who speaks Kinyarwanda, they call it virtual reality. They don't have a Kinyarwandan term for it.
Right.
So like to be, you know, speaking in Kinyarwanda and then I would hear virtual reality. They're like, what? And I found out later they just don't have a term for it. And so then they're getting that culture piece, which then also helps lower affective filters and make them feel more comfortable and make them feel more accepted within the school because they're able to speak to something that is much more universally known. And so they don't feel so separate and apart because they no longer feel like they have a deficit that they have to make up for.